When people hear the name Robert Duvall, they think of authority, composure, and a presence so commanding it never needed theatrics to dominate the screen. For over half a century, he stood as one of Hollywood's most respected actors, the quiet force behind some of cinema's most unforgettable performances. From the calculating calm of Tom Hagen in The Godfather to the chilling confidence of Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore in Apocalypse Now, Duvall mastered the art of controlled intensity. But in recent years, something shifted. The appearances grew rarer. The interviews became fewer. The once constant figure of classic American cinema seemed to retreat into the background, and with that retreat came whispers. What was really happening behind the scenes? Had age finally caught up with him? Was there a hidden struggle the public never saw? It's important to state clearly that Robert Duvall has not died, and there has been no confirmed tragedy surrounding his final days. Yet the internet thrives on dramatic headlines, and speculation often grows louder than truth. The phrase tragic final days captures attention because audiences fear losing legends. But the more compelling story may not be about death at all. It may be about distance, aging, and the quiet reality of a man who never sought the spotlight for its own sake. Unlike many actors of his generation, Duvall never built his identity around celebrity culture. He emerged from a disciplined acting background, studying alongside future giants like Dustin Hoffman and Gene Hackman. This was a generation that treated acting as craft, not spectacle. Fame was a byproduct, not the goal. And perhaps that philosophy explains why, as Hollywood transformed into a franchise-driven, social media-fueled machine, Duvall seemed increasingly out of place. The industry grew louder. He remained restrained. In his later years, Duvall chose privacy over publicity. He spent more time away from Los Angeles, embracing a quieter lifestyle far removed from red carpets and award campaigns. To some observers, that silence looked ominous. When a legend disappears from view, the public assumes decline. But stepping back is not the same as fading away. For a man who built his reputation on subtlety, retreat can be a statement of control. There is also the undeniable truth about aging in Hollywood. The roles change. The scripts become fewer. The industry that once celebrated maturity begins to chase youth. Many actors fight this shift publicly. Duvall did not. He never launched dramatic comebacks or farewell tours. He simply worked when the right material appeared and declined what didn't resonate. That selective approach created long gaps between projects, and those gaps fueled rumors. Yet throughout it all, there's been no shocking revelation, no hidden scandal, no secret downfall. The shock, perhaps, is that there is no scandal at all. Robert Duvall's legacy is built not on headlines, but on permanence. His performances remain studied, quoted, and revered. The fear surrounding his final days reflects something deeper within audiences, the anxiety of watching icons age. We associate legends with timelessness, and when time inevitably advances, we interpret it as tragedy. But Duvall's story, at least for now, is not one of a dramatic ending. It is one of dignity, distance, and a man who understood that stepping away can be as powerful as stepping into the spotlight. As the years moved forward and Robert Duvall appeared less frequently on screen, the narrative around him slowly shifted from celebration to speculation. Hollywood has a habit of rewriting the stories of its aging legends, often framing absence as decline and privacy as secrecy. But in Duvall's case, the reality seems far less dramatic and far more human. Born in 1931, he built a career that spanned generations, working through the golden age of New Hollywood, the rise of blockbuster cinema, and the modern streaming era. Few actors survive that many industry transformations without either reinventing themselves into caricature or fading into obscurity. Duvall did neither. Instead, he remained consistent, disciplined, and selective. And perhaps the consistency is what makes his later quietness feel so unsettling to audiences who grew accustomed to his authority on screen. The fear surrounding so-called tragic final days often says more about the audience than the artist. Viewers project their own anxieties onto figures they admire. When someone like Robert Duvall, who once seemed indestructible in roles of power and command, slows down, the public instinctively interprets it as an omen. But aging is not scandal. Retreat is not tragedy. What truly shocks people is the realization that even icons are mortal. And for a man who portrayed strength with such subtle conviction, the idea of fragility feels almost contradictory. There is also the deeper psychological shift that comes with stepping away from a lifetime identity. Acting was not just Duvall's profession. It was his discipline, his craft, and in many ways his language. To reduce the frequency of work after decades of immersion inevitably alters one's daily rhythm. The structure changes. The urgency shifts. For many performers, that transition can be destabilizing. Yet those who know Duvall describe him as someone grounded outside of Hollywood's machinery. He cultivated interests beyond film, including directing, producing, and embracing rural life far from studio politics. That separation may have been his quiet insurance policy against the identity crisis that often consumes aging stars. The industry itself has not been gentle to actors of his era. Character-driven dramas, the kind of films that once showcased performers like Duvall, have gradually given way to spectacle franchises and algorithm-driven productions. Roles for older male actors exist, but they are fewer and often less nuanced. Rather than compete within a landscape that no longer prioritized the kind of storytelling he mastered, Duvall appeared to choose dignity over desperation. No overexposure, no forced reinvention, no social media theatrics to remain relevant. In a culture obsessed with visibility, invisibility can be misinterpreted as loss. Health rumors inevitably surface whenever a public figure passes a certain age. Minor hospital visits or canceled appearances become exaggerated into dramatic narratives. Yet there has been no confirmed catastrophic event, no verified collapse, no tragic reveal. What exists instead is time, quiet, steady time, and a man who seems to have accepted its passage with the same composure he brought to his roles. The shocking truth, if one insists on framing it that way, may simply be that there is no scandal to uncover. The absence of chaos feels almost suspicious in a media landscape addicted to downfall. It is also worth reflecting on how Duvall's screen personas shaped public perception of his personal strength. Characters like Tom Hagen radiated strategic control. Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore embodied fearless dominance. Even in vulnerable roles, Duvall projected an internal steadiness. When audiences blur actor and character, they subconsciously expect the man himself to embody invulnerability. But performers are interpreters, not extensions of their roles. The discipline that allows someone to portray power convincingly does not exempt them from the realities of aging. Perhaps the most poignant dimension of this chapter is the quiet contrast between how Hollywood ends careers and how individuals end phases of life. The industry prefers dramatic farewells, emotional speeches, final curtain calls, legacy tours. Duvall offered none of that. His withdrawal was gradual, almost imperceptible. One project spaced further apart than the last. One fewer public appearance. No announcement declaring a final bow. That subtlety mirrors the way life itself changes, incrementally, not explosively. For fans, this creates a strange emotional space. There is no clear ending to process, no definitive goodbye. Instead, there's an ongoing awareness that time is advancing. That awareness can feel like grief in slow motion. The myth of tragic final days attempts to compress that discomfort into a single dramatic narrative. It seeks closure, but real life rarely provides cinematic closure. It unfolds quietly, without orchestral swells or final monologues. Robert Duvall's legacy remains intact. His performances are archived, studied, and revisited by new generations. Film schools continue to analyze his restraint, his micro-expressions, his command of silence. Younger actors cite him as a masterclass in subtlety. That endurance challenges the notion of tragedy. A tragic ending implies destruction or disgrace. What exists here instead is continuity. His body of work stands independent of daily headlines. If there is something sobering about this phase of his life, it is the reminder that even giants eventually choose stillness. The world may crave dramatic revelations, but sometimes the most profound truth is far quieter. A man who gave decades to his craft now lives outside the noise of it. No shocking downfall, no hidden conspiracy, just age, privacy, and a natural narrowing of public life that comes with time. And perhaps that is the real emotional weight behind the story. Not death, not scandal, but the gentle fading of visibility that forces us to confront our own impermanence. The legend remains, the myth persists, but the man, like all of us, moves steadily through the final chapters on his own terms. What makes this chapter even more emotionally complex is the contrast between public mythology and private reality. For decades, Robert Duvall represented stability on screen. He played men who anchored chaos, men whose calm intelligence steadied turbulent worlds. Audiences internalized that image. They saw him as immovable, almost immune to erosion. But time erodes everyone. Not always dramatically, not always tragically, but steadily. And when that erosion happens quietly, without spectacle, it unsettles people even more. There is something uniquely disorienting about watching a titan simply grow older. No scandal to blame, no headline to dissect, just a slow shift of seasons. In Hollywood, endings are often packaged for consumption. Retirement tours, farewell interviews, legacy documentaries. Duvall never orchestrated any of that. He did not script a final act for the public to applaud. Instead, he allowed the spotlight to dim naturally. That decision speaks volumes about his relationship with fame. For many actors, attention is oxygen. For Duvall, it appears to have been optional. The industry he helped shape no longer resembles the one that made him a household name. When he rose to prominence, performance was king. Dialogue-driven scenes stretched for minutes. Silence carried tension. Character arcs unfolded with patience. Today's cinematic environment moves faster, louder, and more commercially engineered. That shift doesn't invalidate modern filmmaking, but it does explain why actors of Duvall's temperament may feel less at home. His power lay in stillness. In an era of acceleration, stillness becomes rare currency. Yet there is no evidence of bitterness. No public statements condemning change. If anything, his withdrawal feels measured rather than reactive. That distinction matters. Tragedy implies suffering imposed by external forces. What we see instead resembles autonomy. A man recognizing when the rhythm of his life no longer aligns with the tempo of his environment and choosing peace over resistance. Another dimension rarely discussed is the emotional toll of longevity. Many of Duvall's contemporaries are gone. Colleagues who shared stages, sets, and formative years have passed away. To live long enough to outlast peers carries its own weight. There is gratitude in longevity, but also isolation. The shared memories shrink to fewer and fewer people. The golden era becomes a story told rather than a world inhabited. That quiet loneliness can be more profound than any public tragedy. And then there is the audience's role. Fans form one-sided emotional bonds with actors. They associate milestones in their own lives with films they watched during formative moments. When an actor like Duvall ages, it triggers reflection on our own timelines. We measure our years against his. His slowing down mirrors our own. In that sense, the fear surrounding his final days is really about collective vulnerability. If someone who seemed timeless can grow fragile, what does that mean for the rest of us? But fragility is not failure. It is not disgrace. It is simply human. The language of shock and tragedy often obscures that basic truth. Aging is not a scandal to be revealed. It is a process to be accepted. Duvall's apparent embrace of privacy may actually be an assertion of dignity in a culture that monetizes decline. He has not allowed cameras to document weakness for sympathy. He has not leveraged age in a spectacle. He has preserved something rare, control over his own narrative. There's also a philosophical consistency in how this chapter aligns with his career. Throughout decades of work, Duvall avoided excess. He never relied on flamboyant theatrics. He trusted subtlety. It would almost be contradictory if his real life concluded with dramatic public chaos. Instead, the tone remains consistent with a man audiences observed for years, restrained, deliberate, grounded. The word shocking loses meaning when applied indiscriminately. What would truly be shocking is discovering betrayal, scandal, or deception. None of that has surfaced. The more sobering reality is that there may be no hidden truth to uncover. Sometimes the absence of drama feels anticlimactic in a world addicted to revelation. But anticlimax is often closer to authenticity. If we examine his body of work, what stands out is endurance. He navigated shifting genres, evolving political climates, and changing audience tastes without losing his core identity. That endurance suggests psychological resilience. It implies an internal anchor stronger than public validation. Those traits do not disappear overnight. They carry forward into later life, shaping how someone faces aging. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson embedded in this phase of his story. The final chapter of a life does not need to be explosive to be meaningful. It can be reflective. It can be private. It can unfold far from cameras, surrounded by personal routines instead of applause. In a culture that dramatizes everything, simplicity can appear mysterious. Silence can look suspicious, but sometimes silence is simply peace. Robert Duvall's legacy remains untouched by rumor. His performances are still studied for their discipline and authenticity. Younger actors continue to cite his control and presence as benchmarks. Film history will not reduce him to speculation about unseen struggles. It will remember the precision of his craft. So when headlines attempt to frame his later years as tragic or shocking, perhaps the more accurate interpretation is quieter and more profound. A legendary actor, having spent decades under intense scrutiny, now lives beyond it. Not defeated, not disgraced, simply older. And in that ordinary reality lies something deeply human. The understanding that even icons eventually return to anonymity, not because they have fallen, but because life moves forward. There is no explosive ending here. No dramatic revelation waiting to overturn everything we believed. What remains is steadiness. And maybe that steadiness, in a world constantly searching for spectacle, is the most unexpected truth of all. What becomes increasingly clear in examining this stage of Robert Duvall's life is that the public discomfort surrounding his so-called final days reveals more about cultural expectations than about the man himself. Modern celebrity culture struggles with gradual exits. It prefers collapse or triumph, scandal or comeback. The middle space, the slow, dignified reduction of public presence, is harder to process because it offers no climax. Duvall's later years do not conform to a dramatic arc. They resemble something far more authentic, a seasoned craftsman stepping away from the workshop when the work feels complete. For an actor whose entire career was defined by internal control, this quiet withdrawal feels almost poetically consistent. Duvall never chased the loudest roles. He chose the right ones. He never needed to dominate a press cycle. He dominated scenes. That distinction matters. Many performers built on spectacle struggle when the spectacle fades. Duvall built on discipline. Discipline ages differently. It does not depend on applause for validation. There is also the subtle psychological recalibration that happens when someone has achieved virtually every professional milestone available. Awards were won, critical acclaim secured, influence cemented. When ambition has been fulfilled, what replaces it? For some, the answer is reinvention. For others, accumulation of more recognition. But for someone like Duvall, whose interviews consistently reflected a grounded temperament, the answer may have been simplicity. Peace over pursuit. Routine over red carpets. The mythology of tragic endings often ignores the possibility of contentment. It assumes that absence must be linked to suffering. Yet many individuals who step away from public life do so not because they are defeated, but because they no longer need the external affirmation. In fact, stepping back can be an assertion of strength. It signals that one's identity is not exclusively tethered to visibility. Another overlooked element is generational philosophy. Duvall emerged from a period when actors valued privacy intensely. Personal lives were guarded. Professional identities were separated from domestic realities. The modern era blurs those lines, demanding constant accessibility. For man formed in a culture of restraint, the expectation to continually perform off-screen may have felt unnecessary. Withdrawal, then, becomes not an emergency response, but a return to baseline values. It is worth considering how narrative framing shapes perception. A headline that promises shocking truth primes audiences to expect scandal. When none appears, the silence can feel anticlimactic. But perhaps the deeper shock lies in discovering that an icon's final chapters are ordinary. Ordinary aging, ordinary shifts in energy, ordinary prioritization of health and personal space. There's something profoundly human about that ordinariness. In examining his trajectory, we also confront the nature of artistic permanence. Duvall's body of work does not erode simply because he appears less frequently in public. Film is archival by nature. Performances exist in perpetuity. A scene delivered decades ago retains its precision. That permanence separates actors from many other professions. Their peak moments do not vanish. They are replayed, studied, reinterpreted. In that sense, his influence is insulated from the passage of time. There is also a broader cultural lesson embedded in this narrative. Society often equates worth with productivity. As long as someone is producing films, interviews, appearances, they are perceived as active and relevant. When output slows, speculation begins. But worth does not evaporate with output. A legacy once built does not require constant reinforcement. Duvall's legacy reached a point of structural stability long ago. It does not depend on continuous additions. Longevity, too, carries complexity. Living into advanced age invites constant monitoring from a public eager for updates. Minor changes in schedule can trigger exaggerated interpretations. In that environment, even normal aging can be mischaracterized as decline. Yet the absence of verified catastrophic events underscores an essential truth. The narrative of tragedy is largely constructed by external expectation. If there is a quiet poignancy here, it lies in the awareness that time moves in only one direction. Audiences instinctively anticipate loss because history teaches them it is inevitable. Preparing emotionally becomes a defense mechanism. Dramatic headlines accelerate that preparation. But anticipation is not the same as reality. The present remains grounded in the fact that Robert Duvall's story has not concluded in scandal or catastrophe. It continues, albeit outside constant public scrutiny. Perhaps the most meaningful interpretation of this phase is not about decline, but about completion. Completion does not imply an ending. It implies fulfillment. A career that achieved depth, diversity, and respect. A reputation unmarred by sensational collapse. A body of work that stands independently of gossip cycles. In a landscape where many legacies become entangled in controversy, that stability is remarkable. The emotional weight audiences feel may stem from confronting impermanence in its most understated form. Not explosive tragedy, but gradual quiet. Not shocking revelation, but steady transition. That subtlety challenges the cinematic instincts viewers have developed. Real life rarely provides a dramatic third-act twist. It often resolves in softness rather than spectacle. In the end, the narrative surrounding Robert Duvall's so-called tragic final days dissolves under closer examination. What remains is not scandal, not hidden truth, but a reflection on aging with composure. A legendary actor who once commanded screens now commands something less visible, yet equally powerful: control over his own withdrawal from noise. There's dignity in that. There's strength in choosing silence when the world expects performance. And maybe that is the most unexpected truth of all. The absence of drama is not emptiness, it is equilibrium. The legend persists not because of how his life will end, but because of how consistently he lived it: measured, deliberate, grounded. In a culture perpetually hunting for shock, steadiness itself becomes the revelation. There's an almost philosophical symmetry in the way Robert Duvall's public life has narrowed. He built his reputation on understatement, on the belief that the most powerful performances often occur beneath the surface. It seems fitting, then, that the closing stretch of his life follows the same pattern. No spectacle, no frantic attempt to reclaim the spotlight, just a gradual settling into stillness. In many ways, this phase mirrors the final scene of a great film. Not explosive, not chaotic, but contemplative. The cultural discomfort with this kind of ending reveals how deeply audiences crave narrative closure. We want clear markers, a final speech, a dramatic farewell, a definitive last appearance. Duvall has provided none of these, and so speculation rushes in to fill the vacuum. Yet when examined carefully, there is no verified collapse, no public crisis, no exposed secret. What remains is simply age and a natural recalibration of priorities that comes with it. It is also worth acknowledging the emotional cost of spending a lifetime inhabiting other identities. Acting at Duvall's level requires immersion. It demands internal excavation. Over decades, that intensity accumulates. When someone who has lived so many fictional lives finally reduces that output, the transition may feel less like loss and more like release. Stepping away from constant transformation can create space for something quieter and more personal. There's a discipline to knowing when enough is enough. Many public figures continue long after passion fades, driven by momentum or expectation. Duvall's trajectory suggests a different calculus. He appeared when the material justified his presence. He declined when it did not. That selectivity may have extended into his later years, not as retreat, but as consistency. The man who refused unnecessary roles may also refuse unnecessary visibility. Another element rarely discussed is the subtle power of self-containment. In a media ecosystem that monetizes vulnerability and rewards oversharing, Duvall has remained largely opaque. His private life has not been turned into serialized drama. That opacity creates mystery, but it also preserves dignity. The absence of confession should not be mistaken for concealment. Sometimes privacy is simply privacy. The phrase "tragic final days" implies unresolved turmoil. Yet the evidence points toward equilibrium rather than upheaval. There are no documented estrangements, no public feuds erupting into spectacle, no financial collapses unraveling decades of work. His professional legacy remains intact. His reputation remains largely untarnished. In an industry where late-career controversies often overshadow early brilliance, that steadiness is remarkable. Perhaps the deeper truth lies in how audiences process aging icons. When someone has symbolized strength for so long, vulnerability feels jarring. We associate Duvall with commanding dialogue, with controlled authority, with an almost immovable presence. Seeing that presence age forces a recalibration. It challenges the illusion that mastery protects against time. It does not. Nothing does. Yet there is quiet grace in confronting that reality without theatrics. Aging, when accepted rather than dramatized, becomes less frightening. It becomes universal. Duvall's later years do not read as resistance. They read as acceptance. And acceptance carries its own form of power. It signals a confidence not dependent on applause. One could argue that the real shock is how undramatic this chapter has been. In an era of viral breakdowns and public implosions, a life concluding in composure feels almost radical. It defies the expectation that every story must climax explosively. Sometimes resolution is gentle. Sometimes it is simply a narrowing of focus. There's also a structural permanence to his contributions that diminishes the relevance of daily updates. Film, unlike live performance, does not vanish. The scenes remain accessible. Future generations will encounter his work independent of current headlines. That continuity insulates his influence from the volatility of present-tense speculation. If there is melancholy here, it stems from inevitability rather than scandal. Time advances. Energy shifts. Public presence contracts. These are not shocking truths. They're constants. Framing them as tragedy may say more about our collective discomfort with endings than about the substance of his life. It is possible that Duvall's final years, whenever they truly arrive, will resemble his career. Measured, disciplined, unsensational. There may be no grand reveal, no hidden drama surfacing at the 11th hour. And perhaps that is fitting. The consistency between his public persona and private conduct reinforces the authenticity that defined his work. Ultimately, the narrative arc that attempts to cast his later life as tragic collapses under scrutiny. What emerges instead is a portrait of longevity navigated with restraint. A legendary actor who, after decades of intensity, chooses calm. A man who once commanded massive productions now commands his own quiet. The world may continue searching for shock, for revelation, for a climactic twist that justifies dramatic headlines. But sometimes the most honest ending is not a twist at all. It is continuity. It is steadiness. It is the gradual dimming of stage lights without applause cues or orchestral swells. And in that understated exit lies something deeply consistent with Robert Duvall's legacy. Power without noise, presence without excess, and a final chapter written not for spectacle, but for peace. As the narrative continues to unfold, what becomes increasingly evident is that the mythology surrounding Robert Duvall's so-called tragic final days is less about documented reality and more about the psychology of legacy. When an artist's presence has been woven into cultural memory for decades, the mere reduction of visibility can feel like a seismic shift. Yet reduction is not erasure. It is transformation. And transformation, especially in advanced age, is rarely dramatic. It is incremental, internal, and often invisible to the outside world. There is something almost paradoxical about the way society treats aging legends. During their peak years, we celebrate their complexity, their discipline, their refusal to conform. But when they withdraw on their own terms, we interpret it as decline. The same independence that once defined their greatness becomes suspicious silence. In Duvall's case, the pattern remains consistent. He has always moved according to his own internal compass. The difference now is simply that the movement is quieter. If we examine the arc of his career, it was never built on frenzy. It was built on patience. He did not flood the market with projects. He selected roles that resonated. He trusted subtlety over spectacle. That philosophy does not abruptly disappear in later life. It evolves into something even more distilled. Instead of selecting scripts, he appears to be selecting solitude. Instead of crafting performances, he is crafting privacy. The tension arises because modern media ecosystems resist ambiguity. They prefer clarity, preferably dramatic clarity. Is he thriving or suffering? Victorious or defeated? The absence of clear extremes creates discomfort, but real life often exists between those poles. It is entirely possible that his later years are neither triumphant nor tragic, but simply lived. There is also a generational dignity that cannot be overstated. Duvall emerged from a professional culture where resilience was expected and personal hardships were rarely broadcast. That ethos shaped his conduct. He has not sought sympathy narratives or exploited vulnerability for relevance. In a time when confession often becomes currency, restraint can appear mysterious. Yet mystery is not synonymous with tragedy. Another layer worth exploring is the emotional recalibration that occurs when someone has spent decades being observed. Continuous visibility alters perception. Public figures are rarely allowed to age privately. Every change in appearance, every pause in activity becomes fodder for interpretation. Choosing to step away from that scrutiny may not reflect weakness. It may reflect preservation. Preservation of energy. Preservation of dignity. Preservation of identity beyond public expectation. There is a profound difference between fading and finishing. Fading implies erosion of impact. Finishing implies completion of a cycle. Duvall's body of work does not show erosion. It shows accumulation. The performances remain intact, studied, and admired. Younger actors continue referencing his technique. Directors continue citing his control. That continuity undermines any narrative of tragic diminishment. It is also important to confront the cultural anxiety surrounding mortality itself. The phrase "final days" triggers a primal reaction because it forces confrontation with endings. But framing aging as tragedy transforms inevitability into drama. Duvall's trajectory, as far as publicly verifiable information suggests, aligns more with gradual transition than catastrophic decline. There are no exposed secrets unraveling a reputation. No scandal rewriting history. No shocking confession redefining his legacy. What remains instead is steadiness. And steadiness can be misread in an era addicted to volatility. We are conditioned to expect implosions. When none occur, we search harder. Yet the absence of implosion may be the most revealing fact. It suggests a life navigated with caution and intention. It suggests boundaries maintained over decades. If there is poignancy in this chapter, it lies not in hidden truths, but in visible humanity. An actor once synonymous with authority now inhabits the natural vulnerability of age. That shift does not negate his earlier strength. It contextualizes it. Strength was never about immortality. It was about discipline in the present moment. There is something quietly radical about concluding a public life without spectacle. No farewell press tour. No orchestrated final curtain. Just a gradual retreat into personal space. That retreat may unsettle audiences accustomed to climactic exits, but it aligns with the authenticity that characterized his work. He never overplayed scenes. Why would he overplay his life? In reflecting on this phase, the temptation to search for dramatic revelation must be resisted. The more compelling narrative is philosophical rather than sensational. It invites consideration of what it means to age with composure, to allow relevance to transform rather than fight it, to accept that visibility is temporary but craft is permanent. Robert Duvall's legacy rests not on the circumstances of his final years, but on the integrity of his contributions. Those contributions remain undisturbed. The films endure. The performances resonate. The influence persists. Time may alter presence, but it does not retroactively diminish mastery. Perhaps the real lesson embedded here is about expectations. We project arcs onto public figures because storytelling comforts us, but life is not obligated to deliver dramatic structure. Sometimes it resolves in stillness. Sometimes the final chapters are not shocking at all. They are reflective, subdued, human. And in that humanity lies the quiet truth behind the headlines. Not tragedy, not scandal, not a hidden unraveling, but continuity. A legendary actor who once commanded global attention now commands silence. Not as surrender, but as choice. In a world that equates noise with significance, that choice may be the most powerful statement of all. At this point in the story, the most revealing detail is not something dramatic that happened, but something dramatic that did not happen. There was no public unraveling. No final interview filled with regret. No explosive memoir exposing decades of hidden resentment. The absence of these familiar end-of-career tropes forces a different kind of reflection. It invites us to examine what a life looks like when it concludes not in chaos, but in coherence. Robert Duvall's career was built on coherence. He understood tone. He understood restraint. He understood that the most powerful moments often occur in the space between words. That sensibility appears to extend into his later years. The public may crave revelation, but he has offered continuity. And continuity, while less sensational, is far more consistent with the identity he cultivated. One of the quiet truths about longevity in Hollywood is that survival itself is rare. Many careers burn brightly and collapse under pressure. Others dissolve into irrelevance through overexposure. Duvall avoided both extremes. He maintained relevance without saturation. He commanded respect without courting controversy. That equilibrium did not happen accidentally. It required discipline. The same discipline likely shapes how he navigates aging. There is also the psychological dimension of detachment. For decades, he inhabited characters with authority and complexity. When someone spends a lifetime mastering control in fictional worlds, they may develop a refined ability to exercise control in real life. Stepping away from public scrutiny can be seen not as retreat, but as boundary setting. In a media environment that rarely respects boundaries, that choice becomes significant. The cultural fixation on final days often stems from an unconscious desire for narrative symmetry. We want the ending to mirror the intensity of the middle. If a career was powerful, the conclusion must be equally dramatic. But life does not follow cinematic structure. It rarely crescendos. More often, it softens. The light dims gradually, not abruptly. Duvall's trajectory aligns with that softer arc. Another overlooked aspect is the role of perspective. For younger audiences discovering his work for the first time, the urgency surrounding his later years may feel distant. His performances exist in perpetuity. A student watching one of his films today experiences the same precision audiences did decades ago. That continuity diminishes the relevance of daily speculation. His artistic presence is preserved regardless of physical visibility. There is also a certain dignity in not narrating one's own decline. Many public figures attempt to control the story by preemptively framing their aging as either triumphant resilience or tragic struggle. Duvall has largely abstained from such framing. He has not dramatized himself. He has not sought to redefine his legacy through confession. That restraint leaves interpretation open, but it also preserves authenticity. If there is an emotional undercurrent here, it is the awareness that time eventually claims every icon. The shock people anticipate may not be about scandal at all. It may be about inevitability. When someone who has existed in cultural consciousness for generations approaches the natural limits of age, audiences brace for loss. Headlines amplify that tension because tension attracts attention. Yet tension does not equal evidence. What stands out most is consistency. The same measured energy that characterized his performances characterizes his later presence. There is no frantic attempt to remain central in a shifting industry. No dramatic pivot into spectacle to reclaim headlines. Just steadiness. And steadiness, though less flashy, is often the truest indicator of inner stability. In examining this chapter, one cannot ignore the broader lesson about legacy. Legacy is not defined by the manner of exit, but by the integrity of contribution. Duvall's contributions remain substantial. They are embedded in film history. They continue influencing craft and performance standards. That permanence reduces the need for a theatrical farewell. There is also a subtle liberation in anonymity after decades of recognition. To walk through life without constant scrutiny after years of it may feel less like loss and more like relief. The world may interpret reduced visibility as decline, but for the individual, it can signify freedom. Freedom from expectation. Freedom from performance. Freedom from constant observation. As the narrative stretches forward, the attempt to locate a shocking revelation becomes increasingly hollow. The evidence does not support collapse. It supports transition. And transition, though less marketable, is deeply human. It reflects the universal arc of energy evolving into stillness. Perhaps the most profound realization is that there may be no hidden truth to uncover because the truth was always visible. A disciplined actor lived a disciplined life. A man who valued authenticity maintained it. A career built on subtlety concludes with subtlety. The arc is coherent. In the end, what remains is not a dramatic unraveling, but a quiet testament to endurance. Robert Duvall's story does not require embellishment to be meaningful. Its power lies in continuity, in the refusal to turn aging into spectacle. In a culture obsessed with noise, his silence speaks clearly. And maybe that is the final insight worth holding on to. Not every legend needs a shocking ending. Some simply need the space to finish as they lived, steady, composed, and untheatrical.